Mr. Greg Dickerson. How you doing, sir?
Doing great, Michael. How are you today?
I'm all right. So one of the things I want to talk about is just really appreciate the fact that you and I have seen a lot of economic cycles or business cycles, and we've experienced some pretty nasty and gnarly stuff, right? The dot-com crash was particularly damaging to the Silicon Valley where I reside. The Great Recession hurt everyone. But normally speaking, the business cycle is not that violent, and it's not up and down. It's much more kind of stable. And I need people to realize that we'll have a couple of recessions every decade or so, right? They just come and go. It's part of the business cycle. We're in an interesting environment now where inflation is another wrinkle we have to deal with, but it's not something we haven't seen before. There's an ilk, there's a population that wants everything to be boom and bust. And that's generally speaking not how the economy works. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, especially now, given the Fed and central bank intervention that we've seen since 0809.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that, we had big booms and busts because they didn't step in. Arguably, and I had this conversation with somebody earlier today on another podcast. The Great Depression would never have happened, nor would it have been sustained if the government would have stepped in a big way, like they did in 0809 and like they did in the March pandemic. If we'd have let 08 and 09 go, we would have been in a depression.
Oh, no question. Yeah. If the Fed didn't step in 0809 and basically put a floor, right? The Fed put, or the bet against the Fed, whatever you want to call it. If the Fed didn't come in and put that floor, we would have been in a depression. No question.
Yeah. So that's where we're at now. So, you'll see some peaks and valleys, but yeah, you're not going to see the huge crashes that lead to any sustainable economic downturn because of that reason, because, the Fed and the central banks and the global economy is not going to let it happen because we are so, tied at the hip, globally in terms of, credit markets, monetary policy, things like that. So very interesting times. What we don't really know is what are the long-term effects of all that. We're seeing, bubbles in all classes of assets, all of them, markets, commodities, real estate, everything's in a bubble. You could call it a bubble. Some people say it's not a bubble. It's just a result of what we've been doing.
Yeah.
So the question is, how long can you stay on that path? How far can it go? And we're already seeing the market start to taper a little bit and, take some profits off the table.
Mm-hmm.
So how deep will that go? Is it going to be a correction? Is it going to be a crash? We don't know.
Yeah. But I really want to highlight is the economic cycle is real, but it doesn't always lead to this gigantic bubble and then this horrific crash and this gigantic bubble and this horror, right? We will have recessions. They could be short or they could be long. And again, a recession, like we talked about, I think it was episode 1, is 2 quarters of negative GDP growth back to back. Those happen.
Well, the other thing too is the population's grown.
Yep.
Right. And we are consumers. Everybody in the world is a consumer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what drives economic growth, right? I give you $1 for something that you have to offer. And then you take that dollar and you pay your suppliers and vendors, and then they take those dollars, and it just constantly recirculates around the economy. And a lot of people don't fundamentally understand, how does an economy work? Supply, demand.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, there's way more demand than supply for a lot of reasons because of the, supply chain constraints due to the pandemic still, labor force shortages still, and, demand. We are still buying goods and services because we have to live. And as long as there's more people in the world than there is supply of these products, or more demand from those people, it's going to continue to grow. And that's the one thing I think a lot of people don't talk about in their economic forecast, is just the population of the world, especially in like the United States, countries around the world that have money to purchase, that have demand power, is what's driving the global economy.
Yeah, one of the simplest definitions I remember from one of my econ classes, I don't remember which one it was basically inflation is caused when there's too much money, currency, chasing too few goods. And what have we done the last 18 months? The world has pumped ungodly amount of liquidity into the system, not only the US, but the ECB and Asia and this and that and this and that. There is so much money, currency just floating around, right? I think the overnight market is now like $1.8 trillion. It's just so much money out there that it is going to be the the embers that really keep inflation going for years to come, I think.
Yeah. The other thing too is life expectancy. So not only are we increasing in population, but,
Mm,
we're living twice as long as we did, 50 years ago. And,
wow.
even going back, like we were looking at data from the 70s, it's very, very different now in terms of measuring, growth and economic output and demand just because of those reasons. We're living longer, we're growing faster, all those types of things. So that drives economic growth globally.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, one of the things that I really wanted to talk about here is the business cycle. Recessions do provide opportunities, right? If you're out there and you can see them, you can understand a changing market. They do create opportunities for people to come in and scoop up assets at, I'll call it, reduced prices.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And recession is just an economic downturn. Usually around 10% for a couple of sustainable quarters. That's when you have recessions. So we have recessions all the time,
Yeah.
and we're going to continue to see them. And it's just economic slowdown is all that is. The March 2020 was a recession. Yeah, there's always opportunities in every market, going up or going down. There's bigger opportunities, generally in declining markets than there is in boom markets.
Yeah. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is because a lot of people have been, I mean, I'll go back to Ken McElroy, who is someone I talked about, I think it was 18 months ago. He talked about a 40% crash coming to real estate markets. And you and I talked, as I did with many of our experts. I'm like, Ken, you better stick to apartments because you don't know single family. And it didn't happen, obviously. But, there's just, I don't know what it is. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't just implode like that, at least in my experience.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, if you're talking about the housing market specifically, there's just too much demand right now. And what could implode that? Well, what's driving demand? It's the availability of credit
Correct.
and low interest rates. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
You eliminate one or both of those, and you will see an instant overnight crash.
Yeah. I don't know if it'll be instant. Real estate doesn't move that fast, but certainly would
You were here 0809.
I was, yes. It rolled over again. 0809.
That was pretty fast. I'm not talking about the stock market. I'm talking about housing.
Yeah.
I'm talking about housing.
Yeah. Housing, again, nationally speaking, which is who I speak to, they were certain, like my market went down 75%, peak to trough 70, nasty. But the national housing market, the worst year ever was 2009, I believe, negative 8.9%. Now, we did have 5 years of negative appreciation, but again, I don't call it 5 years instant. There were certainly markets that were just overnight, but when you talk nationally, it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I mean, there's always pockets that are going to be more demand than others, but what I mean is not necessarily values crashing overnight. That took a little bit of time to work its way through.
Yes.
A lot of markets didn't even recover really until 2016.
16 years. The house I sold at the peak didn't get back to the peak for 16 years. Absolutely.
Yeah, and generally those cycles are 10 to 12 years in real estate where you see the peaks and valleys back to the peak.
Totally agree.
They generally run that. This one was a little bit longer because of what happened, but what I'm talking about is demand. So
yes, that'll be
demand, sales, that shut off like a faucet overnight because you couldn't borrow money.
Yep.
The banks they stopped.
Oh yeah.
They stopped lending. 0809. Now that was a unique environment where it was a banking crisis and it was a housing crisis. So, that dried up, but I was still able to borrow money from banks and get loans and things like that. So it wasn't everybody everywhere, but that put a huge dent in demand. So I guess that's kind of more what I mean than anything else. It does. It takes a while for those values to
ripple through. Yes.
Right. Because sellers, and I remember back then when I was buying property, because I was one of the few people that could still buy and I was trying to buy as much as I could. And I kept hearing from sellers, oh, no, it'll be worth twice as much in 10 years.
Exactly.
Well, they were wrong. It wasn't worth twice as much in 10 years. It took 15 years, but it did go back to twice as much.
It did.
So they were right in the long run. But
yeah. And that's what real estate is. And again, to your point, it'll hit demand instantly. But there are two parties involved in a real estate transaction, and the other one is the seller. Sellers are very sticky. It doesn't change that fast. The only transactions that happen on a down cycle are the have to, right? If you can hold on, it's like, hey, honey, we don't need that bigger house. We can stay here. You just won't sell. So this
is 2021. So how many years has that been since 2009? That's been
12 years.
12 years. So it's taken, well, they were almost right. They said twice as much in 10 years, and it's taken almost 12 years. And some of those properties are about double what they were 12 years ago
Yeah.
when it was going down.
Yeah.
you
If
know?
you can hold on, I mean, again, right. My example, I sold a house. I did a 1031. I sold it 264. 6 months later, it's worth 300. So I sold a little early. 3 years later, it's worth 75. 75. So 300 is 75. And then just late 2020, it got back to 264, which is what I sold it. It's still not back to 300.
Yeah.
So again, it's just where we're at in this cycle.
It's crazy. And we saw that run up to 0809. So, properties had doubled and tripled, in a 10-year period running up to 0809. And we saw it pull back. And, we're kind of there now where, over the last couple of years, we've seen, what's it, 30%
Yeah.
housing values have increased
Yeah.
nationally.
24 months. Absolutely. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
So this is a lot of fun. Great conversations. How can people find you?
Yeah. GregDickerson.com. That's where all my info is. Come check it out.
Very cool. Thanks, Greg. Thanks for your time this week. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.